In July 1863, the two great armies of the American Civil War met in a small Pennsylvanian town called Gettysburg. Their ensuing battle would become more than just a pivotal moment in the American Civil War, with the loss of more than 50,000 soldiers in 3 days. At Gettysburg, a century of grand Napoleonic tactics died, and in their place, the industrialized total warfare that defined the 20th century was born. And this is the weapon that made it possible. The Springfield rifled musket, model 1861. It won the Union Army its great victory and changed the face of war forever. The American commanders began the Civil War using the tried and tested tactics more familiar to Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington.
It was lines of men, tight formations, delivering volleys of unaimed fire at relatively short ranges into approaching infantrymen, until you had some indication that the enemy infantry line was weakening, that it was about to crack, and the culmination of the battle would be an infantry charge delivered by bayonet over about the last 50 meters.
These tactics weren't just dictated by the generals, but by the limitations of the infantryman's firearm, the smooth-bore musket. This was little more than a plain metal tube, closed at one end that formed the musket barrel. Gunpowder was poured into the mouth of the barrel, and the lead ball, smaller than the bore, was easily rammed down on top. This gunpowder was set off by sparks from a flint, which ignited a tiny primer of gunpowder. It was not the most reliable of systems, especially in wind and rain. Only 20 years earlier, the American generals who fought the Civil War had cut their teeth in the Mexican War of 1846. Their use of Napoleonic musket tactics had proved utterly decisive.
One of the characteristics of the commanders on both sides was that they had their early combat experience in the Mexican War in the late 1840s, which was essentially the last war fought with smooth-bore weapons. So their notion of appropriate tactics was that decisive action should take place at very short ranges.
When the Civil War started in 1861, who could doubt it would be the Mexican experience all over again?
I think, as with so many wars, it was expected to last 3 months or be over by Christmas, or some cliche equivalent. The first Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run, was predicted to be a great southern rout. Members of Congress and wives and families came out in carriage loads and set up picnics and so forth. And the cold reality and the rout of the Union Army made the point, and there were very few picnics after that.
Those on the battlefield too would learn a painful lesson. The Civil War was not a replay of those that had gone before.
The Union Corps commander, John Sedgwick, is standing in his lines, and it's the famous quotation where he is moving men around in the lines, and one of his young soldiers ducks when a bullet goes overhead. And the last words that General Sedgwick uttered were something like, "My man, there's no reason for you to duck. They couldn't hit an elephant at this range."
Away from the carnage of the front line, there had been a quiet revolution in the science of infantry weapons. Here, at the Springfield Federal Armory, nestled in the green Connecticut Valley, far behind the Union lines, the art of war was about to be transformed. Since 1790, the American government had poured millions of dollars into this combined weapons laboratory and factory. In 1855, 6 years before the outbreak of the Civil War, their decades of research finally bore fruit in the shape of this, their Springfield rifled musket. Quicker, more accurate, and with far greater range than the old Napoleonic smoothbore. For its designers, it represented the epitome of an infantry weapon.
This is the model 1861 rifle musket caliber 58 as manufactured at Springfield Armory in 1862. It basically is composed of three parts: the lock, the stock, and the barrel. It has a very nice bounce to it. As you can see, the bounce of a rifle musket should be approximately where my hand is now. And as a result, the 61 was probably one of the best type weapons that were ever used, especially in that period.
This new gun beat the old smoothbore on every count, rendering it obsolete at a stroke. It may look like the old musket, but in three vital areas it was a huge step forward. The cantankerous flintlock had gone, and in its place was this, the percussion cap and hammer.
I believe it's a dentist out in the Midwest, probably Indiana, who finds out that mercury fulminate will explode if you hit it with a hammer. So he builds what we now know as the percussion cap in the Civil War. What you have now is better wet weather performance, and what you have is the ability to fire faster.
Next, they turned their attention to the barrel. With its smoothbore surface and its loose-fitting ball, the old musket could provide neither range nor accuracy.
Fire!
But by adding a long spiral groove to the inside of the barrel, a bullet could be made to spin, making it go precisely where it was aimed. This was called rifling.
You could triple the accurate range of your infantryman using a rifled musket.
But rifling had a major problem. For it to work, the ammunition had to be fat enough to grip the grooves inside the barrel. With a muzzle loader, like the Springfield, such a bullet would have to be hammered into the barrel to load it. Fine when out hunting, but useless in the heat of battle. The answer lay in a new kind of ammunition, the Minié bullet. Though nicknamed the mini ball, it actually had the conical shape of a modern bullet. Because it was smaller than the Springfield's barrel, it was as easy to load as the old musket ball. Its big secret lay in the hollow base. When the Springfield was fired, this would expand to grip the grooves in the barrel, giving the mini ball the spin it needed for its accuracy and range.
These are the Minié type conical bullets, and as you can see in the bottom, that they do have this so-called cavity, and this is what expands when the powder charge is set off in the chamber of the rifle, and it's fired.
Together, these new features made Springfield's new rifled musket far more lethal than the old smoothbore. Nothing showed this more clearly than one tiny addition to the top of the barrel. Rifle sights. Something no smoothbore would ever have needed. You pointed a smoothbore, but you aimed a rifle.
Now we have this rifled musket that has the capability of being lethal at 750 to 1,000 yards, and certainly accurate at 200 to 250 yards when it's in the hands of a reasonably well-trained rifleman.
Aim! Fire! Cover up!
Just this one change turned the battlefield upside down.
In one day alone, more than 26,000 soldiers were lost on this new battlefield. It was to be one of the bloodiest wars in history.
Near nightfall, the awful carnage ceased, and one of my officers assured me that he could have walked on the dead bodies of my men from one end of my lines to the other.
Despite the carnage, recruitment was not a problem. On both sides, there were huge pools of committed volunteers, men all too eager to replace those that had fallen. In this respect, too, the American Civil War was a modern conflict, fought not for territorial gain, but for ideology, by two armies desperate to defend a way of life.
The American Civil War was fought by an interesting group of people, actually rather unusual in military history. They grew up under a democratic tradition. They were highly motivated in terms of their goals and objectives.
The Union soldier really felt that they were preserving the Revolution, that their forefathers had built this country, and that now they were going to prevent it from being destroyed by the Confederate States of America.
On the Southern side, people were, at least in their own mind, idealistically motivated to preserve their way of life, to essentially defend their ideas about what the United States should be and what democracy should be, and that states and their rights were preeminent over the federal government.
These huge numbers posed another problem. For the first time, the generals were faced with the challenge not of producing enough troops, but enough guns to arm them. Here too, the Springfield Armory was to provide an unforeseen answer, able to produce not just better rifles, but far more of them. Part of the Springfield experiment had been to perfect production methods by replacing craftsmen with machines, using standardized and interchangeable parts. It had taken 4 decades and huge sums of government money to get this right. The aim had never been to increase quantity of production, but simply to rationalize it.
The ideas come mainly from France. This attachment to the idea of standardization is part of Enlightenment thought, rational thought. The idea being that if you produced arms across your entire weapons systems that were standardized, that would simply be more rational, that you could allocate budgets more rationally, that you could repair weapons more rationally, and things overall, system-wise, would fit better together.
To accomplish this, the job of each workman was subdivided, so that each was performing a smaller and smaller part of the process more and more often. And machine tools were designed to replace the skills of the gunmaker. With the outbreak of war, the Springfield Armory faced a new and unexpected problem. It was not enough to machine build a perfect rifle. Now the factory had to build them in unprecedented numbers. It fell to Colonel Alexander Dyer, a top Union Army troubleshooter, to transform output from quality to quantity.
What Dyer did very dramatically when he came in was reorganize the way work was done. For example, 10 days after he arrived here, he issued an order that there are going to be 2 10.5-hour shifts a day instead of 1.
Dyer's new method saw production rates explode. Without knowing it, Colonel Dyer had invented mass production and taken it to war.
Immediately prior to the Civil War, the Armory was turning out perhaps 20,000 arms a year. That's, what, about 1,500 a month. At the peak of production here, which would have been in 1863 and 1864, they were turning out on the order of 25,000 a month.
The Civil War was a new kind of war. There was a new weapon that could kill from greater range and faster than ever before. It was being fought by a highly motivated pool of soldiers. And for the first time in history, it was a war that was being decided not just on the battlefield, but in factories many miles from the fighting. So valuable had the arms factory become that when Springfield's sister plant in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, found itself in Confederate territory, the North was prepared to do anything, rather than let it fall into Confederate hands.
The captain who's in command there burns the buildings, but the machinery is still there. So the rifle-making machinery is captured and taken south, where they use these machines to make Model 1861 Springfields in the Confederate fashion, and to make parts.
So great were the numbers of soldiers fighting that even with the explosion in output at Springfield, it was 1863 before production finally caught up with demand, just in time for the two armies' fatal meeting in Gettysburg. In June of 1863, the Southern commander, Robert E. Lee, invaded Pennsylvania with his undefeated rebel army. General George Meade led a Northern Union army in hot pursuit. When they finally met at Gettysburg, the Springfield rifle would have its day.
The advance units ran into each other rather by accident. The Confederates were marching to Cashtown because there was supposed to be a large supply of shoes. Meade came northwestwards from Washington, and they came up behind Lee, and he simply could not afford to be so far from his base of operations and allow the Union Army to get between himself and his own territory.
For the first 2 days of the battle, the fighting was intense and bloody, without either side achieving a breakthrough. On July the 3rd, the two armies faced each other across a mile of open ground. The Union Army occupying Cemetery Ridge on one side, sheltered behind a low stone wall. It was now that Lee made his crucial decision. He ordered General George Pickett to mount a full frontal charge, sending 12,000 men against what he took to be the Yankees' weakest position. It was in the finest tradition of Napoleonic daring, but this time it would be against soldiers firing Springfields, not smoothbores. General Lee had had plenty of opportunity to see the devastation wrought by the new rifled musket, but despite this, nothing could deter him from his desperate gamble. Lee had ordered Pickett to aim for a clump of trees in the middle of the opposite ridge. The line was thinnest here, and Lee was convinced the soldiers huddling behind the wall were exhausted. Maybe they were, but every Yankee soldier had his rifled musket cocked and ready. At 3 p.m. on a sweltering July afternoon, more than 12,000 Confederate soldiers stepped out onto the ground between the lines and advanced in one last great Napoleonic charge. At the bottom of Cemetery Ridge ran the Emmitsburg Road, far beyond the range of the old smoothbore musket. But as the Confederates reached it, the Union infantry rose up from behind the wall and opened up with their Springfields.
In the day of the smoothbore musket, you could have 100 meters to cover at a run under deadly fire. And in that time, you could expect to receive about 2 volleys of fire from the infantry that you were closing upon. All of a sudden, that killing range has gone from 100 meters to 500 meters. Now soldiers are going to advance through 7 or more volleys of fire to be able to close the bayonet range. The idea of courage had a very specific meaning to Civil War soldiers. Courage was demonstrated by advancing into enemy fire. That was the ultimate demonstration of it. Your whole social group has come with you to this battlefield, and if you do not advance and you're standing shoulder to shoulder with them, there is no escaping.
Being hit by a mini bullet was much more traumatizing than being hit with the earlier musket bullet. The impact on bone and flesh was pretty terrifying because it would hit a bone and splinter the bone into the surrounding flesh. It was the low velocity and the large amount of lead that was striking the human body that caused terrible wounds.
Great gaps were made in their ranks as they moved on, but they were closed up as deliberately and promptly as if on the parade ground. Men fell like 10 pins in a 10 strike. Without a pause and without losing step, the survivors went on as serenely and unfalteringly as before.
In the space of a few hundred yards, a force of 12,000 had been cut to pieces. Only one officer, General Lou Armistead, made it as far as the stone wall. And of the 12,000 men who made the 1 mile assault, barely 300 were left to follow him.
Brave Armistead overleaps the wall and calls on all to follow. But now the enemy has made a stand and are rallying. The final moment has come when there must be instant flight, instant surrender, or instant death. When the smoke cleared away, Pickett's division was gone. In half an hour, the contested field was cleared, and the Battle of Gettysburg was over. General Robert E. Lee said, "General Pickett, place your division in rear this hill and be ready to repel the advance of the enemy should they follow up their advantage." General Pickett, with his head on his breast, said, "General Lee, I have no division now."
After Gettysburg, General Lee never regained the upper hand. Under Generals Sherman and Grant, the North used its superior numbers and industrial might to invade the South and force it to its knees. With the Springfield rifle's greatly increased killing range, the American Civil War battlefield had stopped looking like Waterloo and had started to foreshadow the trench warfare of the First World War. A year and a half after Gettysburg, Lee finally surrendered, and the American Civil War ended. Mass production of the Springfield rifle had been one of the decisive factors in the Union victory.
The adoption of the rifle small arm had a huge effect on every aspect of what went on in the battlefield during the Civil War. Small arms overwhelmingly inflicted the largest amount of casualties on the battlefield. You're talking about a total of around 600,000 human beings died by virtue of battle injuries in the Civil War. This is vastly larger than any war the United States Army has ever fought. In that respect, it was a modern war.
But the clearest sign of the arrival of modern war was mass production in the Springfield factory. It had become as central to war as the weapon that it made.
The Springfield rifle musket was probably as good a weapon as was available in the Civil War, but it may not have been as decisive as the presence of a factory like the Springfield Armory. With an operation like that, the weapon itself becomes much less important than the volume of output. Given output like that, you might have been able to win the Battle of Gettysburg with longbows. You know, they could have made 1 million of those here with no problem.
The Springfield philosophy of mass production would give America the basis for her new industrial might. And when it first arrived in cities like Detroit, it wasn't known as mass production, but as armory practice. In the world wars of the 20th century, the factory would become as much a part of warfare as the soldier and his rifle. In World War II, the industrial heartlands of the Midlands and the Ruhr Valley would see some of the most intense bombing of the war.
It's no coincidence, for example, that Detroit during World War II is known as what? It's known as the arsenal of democracy. And in fact, it was the capabilities of American manufacturers during World War II in terms of converting from civilian products into war material. Mass producing these implements of war was decisive well before the atomic bomb was used.
Factory techniques and the associated research and development establishments that they played off enabled countries to deploy much more deadly weapon systems in huge numbers, which allowed the wars, the industrial wars of the 20th century to transpire.
Tomorrow, Decisive Weapons continues with the American F-117A stealth fighter. During the Gulf War, early warning systems were breached with devastating consequences. Decisive Weapons, 7 o'clock tomorrow.